Hi, it's Vena Jones Cox, and I put out a call the other day on Facebook and to my email list about video topics you guys wanted to see, and one of the requests I got was to explain the difference between land contracts, contracts for deed, land installment contracts, bonds for deed, lease options, lease purchases, and rent to own. And I understand the confusion because you hear about these things and they're all talked about as ways of buying or selling properties, and they can look pretty similar. You know, they're all ways of people doing business with each other instead of having banks involved. And there can be an upfront payment on each of these, and there's a monthly payment on each of these. And the goal of each of these is for the person who is buying on the document to ultimately own the property. But they're actually very, very different in the way that they function legally. So let's start with this. Everything above the line here is all the same thing. Land contracts, contracts for deed, land installment contracts, and bonds for deed is just what they're called in different parts of the country, and they're all exactly the same concept. Lease options, lease purchases, and rent to own are also exactly the same thing and exactly the same concept. So basically, this is what we've got here. Above the line, all of these things are an actual sale of a property. Now, what confuses people about them is that the sale commences the day we sign the land contract or contract for deed or land installment contract or bond for deed, but it doesn't actually finalize until the last payment is made. These things all work very much like buying a car does in a lot of the country. You know how when you buy a car, you don't actually walk out of the car dealership with the title to the car unless you happen to have paid cash for it. If you owe money on it, what you walk out with is a duplicate title, and the actual title remains with whoever financed the car. So if I were to go down to the Division of Motor Vehicles and I were to look up the title on your car, what I would find is that Huntington Bank was the owner of your car, or Fifth Third Bank was the owner of your car, or maybe the car dealership, if they financed it, they were the owner of your car. But what you have, of course, in that arrangement with your car dealer is all the rights of an owner. You got the right to drive it, you have the responsibility to insure it and drive it safely. It's kind of like you own the car, but the title's not in your name. This is exactly what happens in these land installment contract type arrangements. You actually buy the property according to the IRS. You can start deducting the interest. You can start deducting the real estate taxes. If you bought it as an investment property, you have the responsibility to maintain it and keep your neighbors happy by not throwing trash in your yard and all of those sorts of things. But the title actually transfers at the time of the last payment. So of course, the reason that people who do business with each other instead of banks use these is because in many states, such as my state of Ohio, the other way of transferring ownership, which is I give you the deed and I carry back a mortgage, is a difficult thing for individual people to negotiate their way through if the payments go into default. In Ohio, it takes about 6 to 9 months minimum to foreclose someone out of a mortgage. Now, that's something a bank can afford. They can afford the $15,000 to file the foreclosure, and they can afford to pay the taxes and insurance for 9 months while the legal system is grinding its way, and the person ultimately is, of course, loses the property. But normal people who just sold a house on a land contract, that's not a reasonable thing for them to risk. So if it weren't for these things, normal people wouldn't risk selling to other normal people on a land contract, contract for deed, or bond for deed. Now, having said that, folks who buy on any of these things actually do have a lot of protections. It's not like I can just walk into your house one day if you bought a house from me on land contract and say, yeah, you're out. I like this house and I don't like you, so goodbye. There's, of course, laws in every state about how you can, in fact, get your property back if the land contract buyer doesn't pay. It's not an eviction. It's not something that takes 30 days. It's usually a somewhat longer process, and it requires legal notice. And of course, it can only be done if the person who has the land contract stops making payments or otherwise violates the terms of the land contract. Now, let's move over here to the lease option, lease purchase, or rent to own. These are all just different ways of saying the same thing. And what it's saying is the person living in the property has a lease just like any tenant, but they have a second contract that kind of adds something to that lease, which is an option to buy the property. The option is kind of like a purchase contract. It outlines the terms of the future purchase. It says you've got this many years to do it, and the price is going to be this, and at the closing you're going to pay this, this, and this, and I'm going to pay this, this, and this. Lease options are really the correct term for it. Some people would say, well, no, a lease purchase is better because in a lease option, the buyer has the right to buy the house. In a lease purchase, they have the obligation to buy the house. That's not actually true. The downside of not buying a house when you have a lease purchase is exactly the same as it is if you don't buy it when you lose a lease option. When you use the lease option, you lose any option money that you put up front. You also lose any repairs that you might have made to the property. It's the same exact thing, different name. And rent to own is actually just a more colloquial term. Many times when I have a lease option, I will actually advertise it as a rent to own because people have a better grip out in the public of what a rent to own is. They know what a rent to own computer is, and so they kind of get immediately what a rent to own house is. Folks who are buying under a lease option or lease purchase aren't actually buying, they're actually renting. And the major difference between these two things is that in a lease option or a lease purchase or a rent to own deal, the option isn't exercised or the purchase isn't exercised. In other words, they're going to own the property until they can come up with the money to actually pay it off. So in these situations, we're working human being to human being for a while, but in order to finalize this, typically the buyer has to go to the bank and apply for and get a loan. In a land contract, especially under the Dodd-Frank rules that went into effect a few years ago, they're just going to keep paying every month, and at the end of that time, they're going to own the property. So this could be an 8-year, a 10-year, a 15-year, even a 30-year agreement. This is typically a 1, 2, 3-year agreement that either ends with the lease option tenant going to the bank and getting a loan, or it ends with them moving out of the house and not buying it. So, 2 questions. Which of these is better? Which of them is the angel among the two? That's an angel. Those are angel wings. Among the 2 agreements. And the answer is, it depends. If I'm buying a property and I'm only given the choice between a land contract and a lease option, my preference is always going to be for the land contract, because the land contract gives me that equitable interest. That's the legal term for it. When you don't have the title, but you do have the rights of an owner to change the property, fix it up. People who have a property under land contract can actually sell it. And the way they sell it is they find a buyer who wants to pay more than they do, and they sign an agreement, and then at the closing, of course, they pay off the underlying balance of the land contract. On the lease option, could somebody on a lease option turn around and sell the property for a higher price? Yeah, it's a little bit more difficult, and it's not as much of a sure thing, because in this, that right's assumed. In this, the option might actually say they can't do that. They can't assign their option to someone else. So now the question is, which one of these is evil and should be outlawed? The answer is neither one. People contracts aren't evil. There is no way that a contract could be immoral or unethical. Is there such a thing as a bad land contract deal or a bad lease option deal? Of course there is, but that's the deal, that's not the contract. Neither one of these things should be under as much scrutiny as they are. They are both great ways for investors to both buy and sell properties. They're a great way for homeowners who don't quite have the credit yet to go to the bank and and get, meet the government's requirements for getting a loan to live in the house they want. Many times on a land contract, they can fix up the property and they take advantage of that equity, right? Because if I sold this property to you on land contract for $100,000 and you did a new kitchen and a new bath to your house, according to the IRS and according to most state laws, and now the house is worth $150,000, that $50,000 worth of equity is yours. So now you can go to the bank and get it appraised for $150,000 and take out a loan for not only what you owe, but also some of that money that you put into it as well. There's bad actors, right? There's people who sell properties on land contract under terms that aren't really reasonable. There's people who sell on lease option under terms that aren't really reasonable. There's also people who rent houses under terms that aren't really reasonable. There's also people who sell cars under terms that aren't really reasonable. It's not about the mechanism, it's about the individual deal. These land contracts, etc., are governed under your state's law and under Dodd-Frank. Because this is a financing arrangement, you need to get yourself familiar with what the Dodd-Frank rules say about things like qualifying people and balloons, and there's no prepayment penalties. As I said, there's a lot of protections for people buying on a land contract. These are governed under tenant-landlord law. So if your tenant, because remember the option is a future agreement, it's not a right now agreement. If your tenant can't pay their rent, doesn't pay their rent, walks out, leaves the house vacant, it's treated as an eviction just like any other lease. So either way that you want to go, whether you are buying or selling, I strongly recommend that you check out your state's laws in regards to these things. If you don't understand how these work or what an agreement that you're looking at might say, obviously get your own attorney, right? Get your own attorney who is familiar with your local law and with whichever one of these things you decide to use to buy or sell on. So that's the difference between lease options and land contracts. Please subscribe to my channel. If you have any videos you would like to see made, just go ahead and leave them in the comments section below. You can also leave comments, and I'd love it if you would share this with some of your friends who don't seem to know the difference between lease options and land contracts, or who think that they are in and of themselves somehow evil, bad, devil contracts.